아니 아주 드르블로메 위베기 납제 캐나나 맞추다 타타인디 삽존디 ngansungo tanda labda sususugi genda khalia te the kecham shojik sigiyore ngutik sabyon nanole. So among the many other leadership workshops that we hold, I think the ones that is being held now for the school captains is very important one, in fact. And so I'm very glad to be part of this schedule of the students who are visiting Dharamsala. I'm glad that I'm here. Normally, we have to travel more than half a year, so most of the times we are not here. So I'm glad that we are here, and I think I have no choice other than to speak in English because my Hindi is not good enough. You don't speak Tibetan, so I'll have to speak in English. So before I came here, I told them if they can show the introduction of the Central Tibetan administration as a democratic polity, as to how it is structured. I thought that would give you some background about our existence here and how we administer ourselves. So if there are any questions regarding this, I'll be very happy to respond. One choice, of course, is for us to keep this interactive as much as possible. And if you want to start from questions, I'm very happy with that. You can shoot questions and I'll respond to the questions. And then the other option is I'll go through a brief introduction and then we go through question and answer sessions. So if that is what you agree. The reason why we showed the video presentation about the Tibetan democratic polity is because we are the only democracy in exile. And since we are a democracy in exile, we have our uniqueness or peculiarities as you will see it, because we are the only partyless democracy in this world. Amongst intellectuals, I was told, I have not read myself, I was told by a very learned Tibetan that Acharya Vinoba Bhaveji had written about partyless democracy, but there is no practicing partyless democracy in the world except the Tibetans here. So then again the question comes as to if it is partyless, how are we organized in terms of elections? So we are divided into provincial territories that were the hallmark of how Tibet was composed of in 3 different provinces inside Tibet. So each of these 3 provinces, Dotu, Tome, and Central Tibet, Uzang, elect 10 members each, irrespective of the number of electorate here in India, because of the proximity of border between Central Tibet and India from Ladakh to Arunachal Pradesh, which spans over more than 2,100 miles or 3,600 kilometers. It's natural that you have more people from Central Tibet, not the other regions. So irrespective of the number of electorate, we elect 10 members each from each of these 3 provinces. And then we have 4 main Buddhist traditions. Now there are more additions being asked to be included. So each of these 4 Tibetan Buddhist tradition and the pre-Buddhist tradition called the Pon, each of them elect 2 members. So we don't have territorial constituencies, but we do have regional constituencies and religious constituencies. So 30 plus 10, 40. And then now Tibetans are getting more dispersed around the world. So we have 2 representatives from Europe and Africa. Of course, there are very few Tibetans in Africa. We have two representatives from North America and South America. Very few Tibetans in South America. And 1 seat for Tibetans outside India, Nepal, Bhutan in the Asia-Australasia region. So right now we have 1 representative from Australia. So that makes it 45. And since we are partyless, then we don't have opposition or ruling parties. When I asked one of my friends who represented Europe at one time, he was telling me, here it's more like every single individual is a political party. Because unless you surrender your conscience to somebody else, you have the freedom to apply your mind and your conscience based on the issues that come up in the house. But then I think humans are social animals, so somehow you build blocks or groupings within the parliament, and it's quite natural. And I think we all should accept that it's not just in democracy, but as our being, we are prone to have different opinions. Not everybody's opinion is the same. Just as out of these 8 billion people in this world, you won't find one single person who represents exactly like the professor here. Just like you have 8 billion different physical bodies, you have that many different mental dispositions and inclinations. So that is why everybody is different. Even twins who are born just few seconds after each other, who may have lived together all their life, think differently. So differences of opinion is natural, and once you are able to accept that, then again, it makes it much more easier for you to overcome challenges when it comes to those psychological barriers. So that's how, maybe expand a little bit, but then I talk a little bit about, particularly to the young Tibetans, and also our connection with India. Because sometimes we get asked questions like, since Tibet is under Chinese occupation right now, does the Tibetan script has anything to do with the Chinese language? So these are very naive questions, but then important questions that needs to be addressed, because so I was once in Australia, just beginning of this year or sometime in June, July, and at one talk, the topic was India-Tibet ties. And one of my good friends, who was a former member of parliament in Australia, now she's the head of that institution, and her background is also Indian. She's Lisa Singh from Punjab. She started from 7th, 8th century. So I went back some 7, 8 centuries more. We talked about the first king of Tibet having come from India. So we're talking about more than 2,200 years back in history. So that is how old the India-Tibet connection is all about. And if you read history, you hear no mention about India having waged war against the Tibetans, or Tibetans having waged war against India, also because of the natural barriers like the Himalayan mountain ranges. It used to be a strong barrier at that time. So then also the Tibetan script comes from India in 7th century, most probably from Kashmir, because 7th century Kashmir was a hotspot for intellectualism, where Hinduism, Buddhism, and Islam, many scholars come together in Kashmir. And it's derived from the Brahmi and Gupta script. So Tibetan script, if we recite Tibetan script now, the consonants, the 30 consonants, ka, 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 nga, cha, 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 nya, ta, 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 na, pa, 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 ma, it's very similar to Hindi. You have one more addition, ka, 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 ga, nga. And Tibetan vowels are very simple, just 4, I, U, A, O. And Hindi is much more, a, I, U, I, a, so many vowels. I forgot. I studied Hindi only up to class 8. So besides those differences, you can still find the similarity in the language. But the spoken language is totally different. Then Tibetans developed its own language of families of languages. So today, in Tibet, you find 76 different families of languages in Tibet, and 305 spoken languages, language. So that is how Tibetan is one amongst the 15 oldest languages in this world, with more than 1,000 years of history. So It's comparable to one language in Amazonia, another language in Papua New Guinea, and Tibet is the only third language. When you use the language, you have to apply your mind. And that's very unique to only these three languages in this world. So even though most of the languages came from Sanskrit or, Latin roots. So we have a very, very rich language. And the reason also being mentioned by His Holiness often is how Tibetan emperor at that time in 8th century, Tsering, he had a competition between the Hoshang monks, the Chinese monks, because Buddhism went to China way before it came to Tibet in 7th, 8th century. It went to China in 2nd or 3rd century AD. And there was a huge debate between the Chinese Hoshang monk and a disciple of Shantarakshita, who introduced Buddhism into Tibet with the help of Padmasambhava. So Kamalashila was the disciple's name. They had an argument, and the Tibetan emperor decided that we'll adopt Indian Buddhism. So Indian Buddhism also based on the Nalanda tradition, which started from Nagarjuna's time, in 3rd, 4th century. That's based on logic. So where you can even question the Buddha if you think you are smart enough than Buddha. But if you are able to disprove Buddha, you can do that. It's not a blasphemy to do that. So that's also the reason why the Buddhism remains very dynamic. So over 1,300 years, we developed a special characteristic to the Buddhism that came from India. So that is why it is called as Tibetan Buddhism today. So having said all this, just to give you a background about the connection between India and Tibet, language, script coming from India, religion coming from India, the first king of Tibet coming from India, our cultural relations are much more than political or territorial relationships. So often I tell to the younger generations of Tibetans why you need to be proud of being a Tibetan, because we are a repository of one part of ancient Indian wisdom that is manifested in the forms of messages of His Holiness Dalai Lama all around the world. And His Holiness always says, I'm a messenger of India. So it's the wisdom of all the Indian Pandits that created or reshaped Tibetan civilizational thought and its philosophy that dictates its way of life. So first thing we always talk about is the geostrategic importance of Tibet. One time, I remember 15, 20 years back, I met one Pakistani journalist and he asked me, which is bigger, Bhutan or Tibet? So Bhutan, 100 Bhutans might make one Tibet. So we are talking about 10 times the size of UK, 18 times the size of Japan. That's the size of Tibet, almost 2/3 of India. So it's very huge. It's 2.5 million square kilometers out of 9.7 million square kilometers, that including Tibet, the whole of China. That constitutes about 25% of China's landmass. So the geostrategic importance is because we have lived as a political buffer between the two most populous nations in this world, India and China, politically, for thousands of years when Tibet was historically independent. So only after Chinese occupation, there was the first war between India and China in 1962, right? And that took a long time to heal till Rajiv Gandhi's visit to China, and then Narasimha Rao's visit, and followed by Vajpayee's visit in 2003. So all these, and then of course reciprocal visits from the Chinese leadership to India. In future, what we seek is genuine autonomy for the Tibetan people. That's based on pragmatism. Even though Tibet was historically independent, now this 16th cabinet goes around the world spreading this, trying to correct the false narratives that the Chinese government had set internationally on the history of Tibet, claiming that Tibet has been part of China since antiquity, as they say sometimes, since time immemorial. So when is time immemorial? When is antiquity? Well, 500, 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 years ago, just because the earlier claims that they made about Tibet having been part of China since 7th century, 13th century, 18th century went hollow because they couldn't prove it. So that is why we go around telling the world that if there could be a genuine resolution to the Sino-Tibet conflict through what we call as the middle way approach or the policy, which is again a Buddhist concept, avoiding extreme polarities, which is again on the one side the historical status of Tibet as an independent state, on the other side you have the present situation of Tibet under the repressive government of PRC. So we have to find a middle way there. And if we are able to do that, we believe that there could be more peace in South Asia. Because then all this China-Pakistan, all-weather friendship, they have very nice, flowery languages to describe their relationships, higher than the mountains or the sky, deeper than the ocean, sweeter than honey kind of relationship between Pakistan and China. Need not be there, because if there is more trust between China and India, then all these politicking in South Asia need not happen. What Pakistani people obviously need is more economic opportunities, better education, more development, not missiles and nuclear technology to kill people. So in a strategic way, China is creating its deterrence or forces against. That has been China's policy for a very long time, to restrict India's foreign policy to Jammu Kashmir and Pakistan. And that has been happening for a long time. It's only changing now, also because of China's belligerence on the Indian border. So the geopolitical importance of Tibet is very, very important for the whole region. And then we also have the environmental importance of Tibet. When we describe Tibetans, you ask any Tibetan students here, we recite this prayer for the long life of this 14th Dalai Lama. So in the land, or in the heavenly abode, the land surrounded by snow mountain ranges. So that's how we describe ourselves. Because Tibet is surrounded by snow mountain ranges. As you can see, it's not a painted picture. These are all satellite images that are available now. So it's surrounded by the Himalayan ranges in the south. And in the west, it's Karakoram ranges. In the north, the Kundun ranges. On the east, you have series of mountain ranges. And so Tibet is all surrounded by snow mountain ranges. We all know that the tectonic shift between the Gondwanas and the Eurasian plate created this Himalayas. And environmental or geological scientists even today said that Himalaya is growing by 10 millimeter every year because the shifts are still happening. That's also a reason because the whole Himalayan plateau is a seismic zone. You hear, or just recently there was earthquake in China-Tibet border. And there was in Herat recently. In Nepal, you witnessed earthquakes recently. So all these things indicates that the Himalaya is a geo-seismic hotspot. The Tibetans call ourselves land this heavenly abode surrounded by snow mountain ranges. Then the Westerners started coming into Tibet only from the late 16th century, and they called Tibet the roof of the world. Now, why is Tibet called the roof of the world? Because of its altitude. The average altitude of Tibet is about 12,000 feet above sea level. Yeah. So when I always give this analogy of me when I was in Japan, I was talking to students and I asked them, which is the highest mountain in your country? and that's at Mount Fuji. And how high? 3,700, 3,800 meters. That's equivalent to about 12,000 feet above sea level. And I told them that is like base camp in Tibet. You start climbing from there, you know. So just to give them an imaginary view of how high Tibet is. And here you can see on the satellite map, when the pictures are taken from the Indian Ocean, from Kanyakumari, you can see how high Tibet is. You know, it's not a drawing. So that's why Tibet is called the roof of the world. And then today, Chinese environmental scientists call Tibet the third pole. Why? Apart from North Pole and South Pole, Tibet has the largest amount of glaciers and permafrost that feeds all these major rivers in Asia. And now if we go down to the last map with the rivers, you will find that the rivers that originate from Tibet, and the reason why Asians call Tibet as the water tower of Asia, it's like the water tank of Asia. So if you see from the east, you have the Yellow and the Yangtze that flows into China. And Yellow is the cradle of Chinese civilization. And that river originates from Tibet, from my father's country, in that part of the world. And then if it is not for the Yellow and the Yangtze, the Yellow that flows in the north of in China and Yangtze that flows to the south of China, China will not be in a position to support its 1.4 billion people. You know, these are lifelines of China. That's also obvious reason why Chinese government should be more careful about Tibet's ecology and environment, because it does not concern only Tibetans. It concerns the future livelihood of millions of Chinese on the mainland. Then you have rivers that goes down, the Mekong. Mekong originates from Tibet, and it flows into Burma, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, and Vietnam, into 5 different countries in Southeast Asia. Then you have 2 more rivers like Irrawaddy and Salween that flows into Burma. You have the Brahmaputra that flows from Tibet and then takes a U-turn, if you can notice that, the Brahmaputra takes a U-turn to come into India through Arunachal Pradesh. That flows into Bangladesh. Now the news that we are getting from inside Tibet is that China is building a mega dam at this place called the Great Band. In Tibetan it's called Penpa, just north of Arunachal Pradesh, eastern Arunachal Pradesh. They are building a mega dam that's twice the size of Three Gorges, which is the biggest dam in the world. And this mega dam, the new mega dam, is supposed to produce 3 times the hydroelectricity than the Three Gorges. Now you can imagine for that size of a dam how much water needs to be stored upstream, which will again inundate so much area, which will destroy a lot of flora and fauna that are unique to the Tibetan biodiversity there. Yeah. And as I mentioned before also, if something happens to the size of that kind of a dam, what will happen to people downstream? They'll be washed away completely. Not maybe so much in Arunachal Pradesh, except for the villages that live on the banks of Brahmaputra. Because last time, early this year or end of last year, we were in Arunachal Pradesh, and Arunachal Chief Minister Pema Khandula was very kind enough to send us helicopter to travel from Meo to Tuting. And the whole route or the route of that helicopter was over the Brahmaputra. And when we were watching from the helicopter, you can see that the river that's coming from out of Tibet is very, very murky. And all the tributaries that are joining the main Brahmaputra are pristine clear. And that was also not part of the year when it's raining, because the river was not inspect. So when I asked the locals, they said it has been happening since 2018. It's not just recently. So that means a lot of work is going on inside Tibet that are not visible to us right now. And this could be very, very catastrophic. And then you have smaller rivers like Karnali going into Nepal. And then you have the Indus and the Jhelum that originates from Tibet, goes through India into Pakistan, and Indus River is the cradle of Indus Valley civilization. Again, another one of the oldest civilizations in this world. So that is how important Tibet's environment is. If you talk more in detail, you can still talk about the jet streams that flows over the Tibetan plateau and the El Nino impact on the Pacific decides the hot places in India, for example, just one example, as to where the hot areas would be for the next year. And then the depression sets in, and that brings in all the clouds, and then the rains are created. So it's going to impact in more rainfall in the subcontinent. So even climatic conditions on Tibet has its influence on the monsoons, not only in the south, but also in the north, in Mongolia and other areas. And just last 2 months back, I was in Brazil, and I was telling the Brazilians that the impact of the Amazon over the Tibetan plateau also can be seen through scientific research that people have done very diligently. So they have done some very interesting studies watching over the climatic conditions of the whole world, and more particularly from the Amazon over the African to the Middle East to the Asian subcontinent. And they found that when there is more rainfall in the Amazon, there is less snow in Tibet. And when there is less rainfall in the Amazon, which is the lung of the world, then there is more snow in Tibet. So all these correlations also is a pointer towards this Buddhist philosophy of interdependence. So all this applies to our material existence. Then, of course, the Buddhist culture, as I mentioned, how it came from Tibet, India, and how we managed to preserve in its pristine quality through the centuries. And that is manifested in the messages of His Holiness Dalai Lama and the other Buddhist leaders that represents the Tibetan Buddhist community all around the world. And that has the potential to spread more peace and compassion and non-violence in this world. So that's why these days when I travel around the world, I keep reminding the world that there is not enough focus on non-violence. Too much focus on violence, whether it's Gaza, Israel, or Ukraine, Russia, or Sudan, or so much violence happening. And then when there's too much focus from the media and the political leaders, wherever there are violence, then that prompts more people to take up violence because they seem to, or seemingly realize that only violence gets attention. So that's why there needs to be more support for non-violent movements. And now we keep telling governments that if you keep repeating this statement that Tibet is part of PRC, you're going against international law. Because whether it happened to Tibet 70 years ago or it's happening to Ukraine today is the same international law since the formation of United Nations in 1945. The law has not changed. Only the response of the international community has changed depending on which geographical area things are happening. Right? And the second thing we tell them is that if you keep, on the one hand, you keep repeating this statement that Tibet is part of PRC, and then on the other hand, maybe to appease His Holiness or the Tibetan people, say that you support negotiations between the representative of His Holiness Dalai Lama and the Chinese leadership. And we tell them these two don't go together, these two contradict each other. Because if there is no recognition to the historical status of Tibet as an independent state, then where is the ground for China to come and talk to us? So when you keep repeating this statement that Tibet is part of PRC, you are removing the very ground or the leverage for the middle way that we are seeking. And the third thing we tell them is, why is China not asking every other government to say that Mongolia is part of China, or Manchuria is part of China, or East Turkestan is part of China? Why only Tibet? Amongst all the nationalities that they have controlled or occupied. That's because the Chinese government knows that they have no legitimacy of their rule over Tibet. That's why they are trying to seek that legitimacy from the international community by asking or coercing the international community to say that Tibet is part of PRC. Very simple logic. So, of course, if the Chinese leadership has the common sense, that's why I keep joking with our friends outside that if you have a good brain hospital for surgery, then we'll bring these Chinese leaders one by one, do surgery, put common sense in their mind, and then send them back to China. Because it's one of the most easiest problems to be resolved, because we have addressed their main concern of sovereignty. And His Holiness is a Buddhist monk. He will never ever take up violence. And one reason why the Tibetans inside Tibet have not taken up violence is because His Holiness has desisted them from taking up violence. Even going to the point of saying that if you take up violence, I will no more be responsible for the Tibetan cause. So India is a good friend, very, very kind to the Tibetans on humanitarian assistance. India is also the reason why we are here, why we could boast to the world that we are the only exiled government with a fully democratic structure. Everybody is looking up to the Tibetans. And it's not only because of the help of Indian government, but also because of the leadership of His Holiness Dalai Lama. Because His Holiness has always been a true democrat, even when he was very young, even at the age of 17, 18, just 2 years after he took over, he wanted to introduce democratic reforms inside Tibet. But Chinese were already inside Tibet. So, and His Holiness is a true missionary or visionary also, because he thinks very long term. So earlier, when their grandparents or my parents, when they came, we thought that we wouldn't have to live in exile for so long, 64 long years. Even the 13th Dalai Lama came into exile in India in 1910 and returned back in 2 years, when we removed every single Chinese out of Tibet. And the remnants of the Chinese that were there were not sent back to Tibet through the eastern border, but through India. That's why you find Chinese in Calcutta and Kalimpong, Darjeeling area. But more Chinese were removed from these two areas after 1962 war. So you still have Chinese in Calcutta who majorly were those descendants of those who were sent back from Tibet in 1912. So we never thought that we would have to live in exile for so long. Of course, we have our challenges. When I speak very long. So let me stop here and respond to questions, if anything that you would like to know.